All right, so this is part two of week five. And so we've just talked about some ancient and medieval ways of looking at knowledge, the importance of religion and philosophy in the way that people started to initially understand disciplinarity. Um, One thing that seemed to work pretty well was that, there were all these little disciplines, and each person kind of had their specific interest, their little hobby horse. And, would have some old guy who was an ancient historian, and then, and an old guy who was a mathematician, and they'd go out to lunch, and pretty much everyone was an old white dude. So, problems there, but the people who were doing that stuff were happy. Um, and so in the 20th century, we have a lot more crises of knowledge, and they happen in different contexts and they happen in different forms. And some of it could begin, we looked at Newton and the kind of certainty of universal gravitation on the one hand as something that leads to an organized system of knowledge, such as a discipline. Um, and then someone like Einstein, who's working on relativity hundreds of years later, and that, ideas like relativity, uh, scientists like Heisenberg, who are working on indeterminacy, that as soon as you study one part of an experiment, it's hard to make claims about other parts of the experiment. So you're always kind of messing with the things that you're experimenting on. That makes life less certain. Heisenberg's known as having the uncertainty principle. But basically, what that means is that, if you're trying to measure how fast something is and where it is at that exact moment, you're either going to have to slow the thing down to figure out where it is, or you're just going to be measuring the speed of it. Kind of like when you do uh, you know, different kinds of calculus, which we don't have to do that here, and I won't make you. Um, so, um, what you have is a century, the 20th century, that kind of starts off with complex world problems. There's World War One, where all these different countries that had relied on pretty hierarchical structures were all of a sudden upended. You have the communist revolution in Russia, where they took down the czar who had been in control of the country. You have several European countries warring with one another in World War One. And then people had what they thought was kind of an end to that. And then World War Two, which is in many ways even worse. People like to think that everybody's getting better and improving over time. And that when we have good technology, it means we can build a better society. And so when that happens, but that technology is used for bad purposes, like, building atomic weapons, or the mass murder of the Holocaust, all of these things are, um, things that question whether we are in a civilization, whether we are progressing, whether humanity is learning. And so that kind of creates a crisis for people. Um, Everyone liked to think that things were getting better, but apparently they were not. Yes, the non-genocidal side of people won World War II, but that doesn't mean it solved everything. Fragmentation of knowledge. So this is where we get interdisciplinary studies. Is people think, wait a minute, I don't think that the disciplines we have are enough for us to understand the complexity of the world anymore. And so some of the issues are, well, how do we connect the disciplines to each other? How important is the knowledge from particular disciplines to reality and the world around us? So, people who think that someone like me, who's an English professor, that it's my job to like teach grammar, basically, forget that English as a discipline has been trying to kind of understand how people look at the world through literature, how people learn through the words that someone puts on a page, which is more complex than, um, grammar and stylistics, even though those are important as well. Um, when my grandmother was still alive, she knew I taught English, but she didn't necessarily know what that meant. So she said, "You make sure that they, that they write their letters well." So she was thinking about handwriting. So that was sweet. She was a good person. Um, so fragmentation of knowledge, you can't just assume everything falls into a neat category anymore. That's number one. Number two, change in student demographics. I talked about, sort of old white dudes who already had money and probably had several people in their family who, went to college and had money before them. Not as many first generation students. Issues including, higher education becoming democratized, more inclusive, more diverse. Well, guess what? Then the world people want to learn about, we see the diversity of that world when it's not one group of people controlling it. The rise in studying world history has only happened in the last 20, 25 years or so. People used to always have to take Western civilization classes. There's been pressure on curriculum to, speak to and reflect diverse human experiences, conditions, needs, and goals. Um, we do not study homosexuality as transgressive anymore. People used to classify it as a disorder in the psychological manual, the DSM. With more diverse people being involved in research and education, people now understand better the world that everyone lives in. The world is a complex place. And, when we talk about climate change as a very obvious example of something that we need a whole lot of different kinds of knowledge to understand, we see how the disciplines we already have need to do something more to solve real problems, real issues. The world is increasingly complex. It's rapidly changing. It's unpredictable. It's non-local. Everything that happens is global. There were those kind of lectures from maybe a decade ago called Travels of a T-shirt. And it was all about how where the cotton from your t-shirt was grown and where it was farmed and how it got, made into fabric and sewn and marketed and packaged and all the different human beings who were involved on, getting you a simple t-shirt. Back in the day, I think people just bought it and didn't think. And so questions like, is disciplinary knowledge enough? And is disciplinary knowledge a barrier? I find this with colleagues who seem to think that English departments, not at this university, but, people I see on Twitter and whatever, seem to think that English departments are the ones who teach critical thinking. And it's true that you learn critical thinking in an English department, but that doesn't mean historians are sitting on their hands. That doesn't mean psychology is sitting on its hands. So the more interdisciplinary connections we build, the more we understand what our colleagues are doing and we can work together. That's one reason why one of the most fulfilling things I've done at West Georgia is to co-teach with a biology professor. So to kind of recap a little bit and move forward, the 20th century really is a big time for this uncertainty, nonlinearity, and indeterminacy. Schrodinger's cat is another example of indeterminacy, which I talked about with Heisenberg. Schrodinger's cat is a kind of philosophical problem where this guy named Schrodinger thought, okay, well, so let's say you have a cat and it's alive and you put a cat in the box and it's with an amount of radioactive material that has a kind of half-life where there's an equal probability that it will kill the cat or leave the cat alive in, let's say, an hour. So at the end of an hour, is the cat alive or dead? And the answer is kind of, well, both. It's, before we open the box, there's an equal probability that the cat is alive and that the cat is not alive. Obviously, academics like cats a lot, and so that's not a very nice thing to think about. But it's, this idea that something can be alive and dead at the same time, from a logical perspective, is something that made people think quite a bit. The Manhattan Project is where the U.S. atomic bombs were first developed. That, on the one hand, put an end to the Pacific conflicts of World War II by decimating two communities in Japan. But also I've created substantial generational trauma for people and killed many people and harmed the environment in untold ways. Um, that choice alone, is it worth it to bomb people and, you know, create untold damage with this untested technology versus staying in this war for however long? It's an awful uh, decision to have to make, but those are the kinds of decisions that people have to make in complex societies, where it's not as simple as you go out on the battlefield and you have a gun and the other guy has a gun and you kind of like run at each other and only one person makes it out. That feels more equitable than somebody in a plane flying over a city and destroying it and then being gone. So these are the things that people start to think about, these complex ideas. The Holocaust, which I mentioned earlier, as how can a civilized society watch this happen, make this happen, experience this happening, and still, there are people who still deny that it happened. And so these are all examples of why scholars have questioned this idea that we're always progressing toward enlightenment, that Hegel was right, that, everything is about these sort of slow steps forward in progress. And so here are, a couple of ways to think about this as differently. Sometimes people are marching backwards. Sometimes you can't measure the march itself. So that's, with the, indeterminacy, Schrödinger's cat. And sometimes we don't know if we are marching or not, like the people who developed the atomic bomb didn't have to drop the atomic bomb. They didn't have to physically experience it. And that kind of detachment is a problem as well, because it changes what responsibility means when it comes to the knowledge work that people have. So interdisciplinary studies, to kind of conclude for today, in American universities and colleges, here's how they change over the course of the 20th century. It starts with collaboration among social sciences, driven by funding agencies. You have degrees in things like American Studies, which they have at William and Mary, and Area Studies. They had that at my undergraduate institution. People would major in comparative area studies. After the Second World War, you have an increased democratization of higher education, more people attending college on the GI Bill. Hybrid sciences, so like bio and physics. Inter-arts programs, you could see theater and music working together, film and drama. Emergence of a critical movement toward, in some cases, student-centered learning. So, this idea that you don't just lecture, sometimes workshops are great. Then from the 50s through the 70s, we have a lot of the civil rights movement and its impact. So we have themes and problems and individualized study. So these become some different departments like Chicano studies, women's studies, African American studies, during the time when, these topics are very important. And then now we have interdisciplinarity is a lot more normalized. There's generations involved in establishing it. So, medical schools have all kinds of interdisciplinary work, including medical humanities. Business schools do all different kinds of work with psychology, sociology. The curriculum, the subjects comprising a course of study in a school or college, and those can all be very unique. So to think about for the future, think about where you think interdisciplinary studies is going, what kinds of things you wish universities would change.